Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Game Dev Tycoon for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a business simulation tycoon style game by Greenheart Games that was released in December 2012. And it's kind of interesting because at the time it was compared very heavily to a game called Game Dev Story, which was a mobile title that a lot of people said this game ripped off. I haven't played Game Dev Story, so I can't really speak for that, but you can look at the two games and see that they are very, very similar, both in their theme as well as their execution. So, there may be something to that. I don't really know. Again, I haven't played Game Dev Story myself, so I can't really speak to that. But that said, how is Game Dev Tycoon itself? There aren't all that many games out there that focus on game development itself, as opposed to a bunch of other things like you're used to, say, Roller Coaster Tycoon and games like that. But something like this comes along, it's pretty rare. How did they pull it off? Well, as far as the presentation goes, they've done a pretty decent job overall. There are just a few issues with it. As far as the visuals go, they suit the game pretty well. It is a tycoon game. You don't really expect top-of-the-line visuals from it. But they could have done better on some things, like, for instance, the fonts in the game. They are just very boring. They could have done more than that, but they decided not to. Oh well. At any rate, the visuals themselves are pretty decent. They're all 2D, it's sprite work, it's all pretty well done sprite work for the most part. Animations are fairly smooth and fluid, and they work pretty well. You're not really going into this thing expecting top-of-the-line visuals, like I said, so it's all fine. And it's certainly bright and colorful, and that's very well appreciated. That said, the visuals just get kind of plain after a while, and you just don't care. Then there's the sound effects, which are pretty minimalistic. You've got basically a cash register sound, some clicking noises, and that's kind of it, really. The sound effects are very plain. They do what they need to do, and unfortunately, they're just not very interesting. Then there's music, which, good luck with that, because you're going to be hearing the same few tracks the entire game, and they get very boring very quickly. I recommend, if you're going to play this thing, to just turn off the music altogether and play your own tunes, because it gets boring after a while in terms of music. That said, the music is not bad, it's just very, very repetitive. And then there's no voice acting, so there's nothing to speak of there. But overall, they've done a pretty decent job with the presentation. I admittedly wasn't expecting too much out of it, but they've done a pretty decent job with what they got. But obviously what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this game is almost non-existent. You're basically just working your way up from garage development of games to basically becoming the next Valve. And that's pretty much it. You start off in your garage in an early era of gaming, where all that you have available to you are the game's equivalent of the Commodore 64 and the PC, and then you work your way all the way up to the modern era and beyond. And that's pretty much it. The game is pretty self-explanatory from there. You develop games, and you hope that they sell well, and if they don't sell well, then you have problems. And eventually you get the ability to upgrade your office, which allows you to go from being in a garage to an actual office, for one. And then you get to hire staff who will help you develop games better and develop bigger games, and so on and so forth. It goes all the way up to, again, basically becoming a Valve and having your own research department and being able to make your own consoles and things like that. So, how do you get there? Well, developing games is a very straightforward process. You click anywhere on the screen, and it brings up a drop-down menu. You can select Develop Game, and then you get to name your game. You get to select the topic, which is things like medieval, or aliens, or UFO, or space, or things like that. And then you select your genre, which you get a choice between action, adventure, RPG, casual, which you have to unlock, actually, strategy, and simulation. And eventually you will also unlock the ability to have multi-genre games. So if you're wanting to make an action-adventure game, you have to unlock that later on. At any rate, you select your genre, you select your topic, and you want these to be a good combination. For instance, you don't really want something that's, say, virtual pet and strategy, because that just doesn't really make any sense. You want something more like UFO and strategy. Hint, hint, XCOM. Anyway, basically, if you stick to things that you actually know from the actual gaming world, it's going to work. And it's surprisingly easy once you just start thinking how the game thinks to actually get all the way up to the modern era and have ludicrous amounts of money coming in. I will have a clip here showing you what the game is like at the end game, but suffice to say, up until you get to about the midpoint of the game, it can be extremely frustrating. Mostly because the game tells you practically nothing. It gives you tutorials, don't get me wrong, and the interface is very intuitive, it's very easy to navigate. The problem is that the game is terrible at giving you feedback. Feedback is absolutely vital for a game like this. You need to know what you're doing wrong and what you're doing right, and you need to know how you can improve it. What the game tells you, however, is, oh, you've released this game. The reviews have come in. 6 out of 10. Okay. That tells me nothing. On occasion, you'll get one that says, this combination is good, and it's usually just this genre works well on this system, or this genre works well with this topic, and that's about it. So how do you figure stuff out? Well, you have to generate game reports after you've finished your game. And that will give you tiny snippets of information. It'll say, oh, well, this audience works well on this console, or, oh, this genre works well with this topic, or this genre, you should put a bit more emphasis on level design as opposed to the sound, or something like that. And you have to continuously generate these reports, even within the same genre and such like that, even within the same combinations of topic and genre and platform and everything like that, in order to get the full picture. And this is the problem. The game is terrible at giving you this information, so the whole thing ends up being mostly trial and error. You don't know what works. You don't know what doesn't work. You have a vague idea. If you know anything about game development, then you obviously have an advantage over people who don't know anything about it. But even if you do know what you're doing, the game just throws a bunch of curveballs at you. I've had situations where I've done things exactly the same. The only difference being that I've upgraded the engine and I've upgraded the system that I've been developing on. And using the same exact combinations, the original game get a really high score, say a 9 out of 10, whereas the next one gets a 5 out of 10. It made no sense whatsoever. And even though it was like, oh, well, there was this great technical improvement, it doesn't tell me why it got a 5 out of 10 as opposed to a higher rating like it should have gotten. And that is the main problem with this game. It is incredibly frustrating because of the lack of information it gives you. Once you get up to a certain point in the game, it becomes ludicrously easy to just keep afloat, as well as just rake in money left, right, and center. But even doing that, once you've gotten to that point, you're bored with the game, because that's the end game. The game lasts up to 35 in-game years, and then obviously in December of that year, the game ends with this thing where it's like, oh, well, you got a Lifetime Achievement Award. And that's pretty much it. There's not really a whole lot to this game, and the lack of feedback is what absolutely destroyed it for me. Somewhere in there is a decent game. The problem is you have to dig through that horrible lack of feedback in order to get to that sort of thing. And it doesn't tell you any of this sort of thing right off the bat. It gives you the basic idea of how to control the game. I mean, the interface is very intuitive and easy to use. It's mostly sliders and buttons, but that's beside the point. It's a very easy game to get into, sure. And you can make some amusing things here and there, but the actual development part of the game is pretty minimalistic. You just select the title, you select what emphasis you want to put on as far as where your development time goes into. Do you want to put more on graphics or sound, or do you want to put more on world design or level design or things like that? It doesn't tell you, give you any way to influence the mechanics. If you want to make an FPS, well, too bad, you're just making an action game. Well, what if I wanted to make an FPS? No, you can't make an FPS. You have to make an action game. What if I wanted to make a so-and-so? Well, no, you can't do that. You have to make this particular type. It's so simplistic that it kind of gets in the way, and even though it is simplistic, that lack of information is just baffling. In effect, the game is so simple that that lack of information becomes even more of a problem, because you look at this thing and you're able to draw conclusions, but it's done through trial and error, and this game being so simple, you just sit there and you're like, wait, what? Why didn't this work then? And so the game ultimately ends up being an incredibly frustrating experience that's really only good for just passing time while you're waiting on things, as far as I'm concerned. It is a very casual game, don't get me wrong, but again, that lack of feedback just kills it. And I find that when I'm playing this thing, I'm not having fun. I'm just playing it for reviewing. I don't like it when games do that to me. And so, as a result, I have to give this a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.